the White House announced on Monday another $300 million of military aid to Ukraine. The administration says that surprise money came from savings on weapons contracts, and it comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin dropped a different kind of bombshell on Russian state TV, saying he's ready for nuclear war with the West. Take a listen.
Мы действительно готовы к ядерной войне.
Ну, с военно-технической точки зрения мы, конечно, готовы. Они у нас постоянно находятся в состоянии боевой готовности. Это первое. Но это не значит, что, на мой взгляд, они готовы завтра развязать эту ядерную войну. Ну, хотят, ну что ж так делать? Мы готовы.
Joining us now is retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He's a military expert with defense priorities and host of his own show, The Daniel Davis Deep Dive, on YouTube. Thank you so much for coming back on with us.
Always my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, we should be clear that Putin said they're ready in the event of a nuclear confrontation, not that they were about to start a nuclear confrontation. So, maybe you don't want to scare people unnecessarily. Still, is it worrisome to hear that kind of conversation taking place?
Well, in the context of that it was like an hour and a half conversation, so there was a lot of stuff said in there. But one of the other things that jumped out at me from that was that he said, hey, the West seems to think that there are no red lines for Russia. And if there's no red lines for Russia, then we're not going to have any red lines for you either. Meaning that you keep going past them, and if you do, so will we. And in context with his comments about the nuclear issue, that's a real problem, because all of that is in the context of France, of UK, and several others, Poland, talking about NATO troops inside Ukraine and operating there. He specifically also mentioned during that conversation that if American troops come into Ukraine, they are fair game, and he would consider them enemy combatants. So altogether, yeah, it got my attention.
So Congress has been struggling, obviously, to pass more funding for Ukraine, but it did seem to find this surprise $300 million that they say come from savings that they have acquired. Can you give us some sense of how this $300 million is going to be used in the war effort? Is this a drop in the bucket? Is this meaningful? And how dire is the funding situation as it's being presented by Congress?
Well, first of all, for context, $60 billion is going to be a drop in the bucket. So you can imagine what $300 million is going to do. But that whole situation, I guess, got to tell you, it's a little shady, because the administration claims they basically found $300 million because of some terrific job done on contracting and whatever. But then they also didn't mention in any context with that the fact that simultaneously there's a $10 billion hole in our inventories because of all the weapons that we gave away previously. We're needing $10 billion more to replace them because they undervalued them. They did a poor job contracting with the stuff we'd already sent. So we're in a $10 billion hole. Simultaneously with that, the U.S. Army in Europe is about a couple of months away from having to shut down operations for the rest of the fiscal year, because they also have given money away to Europe that to Ukraine that cannot be replaced unless Congress comes through with this additional supplemental. So the question that should be asked first is, if you found $300 million, why is it not going to fill this $10 billion hole we've got, or to fund the U.S. Army Europe so that our operations continue? No one talked about that, and I keep asking why everything is so vital to send to Ukraine when it comes at our expense and the weakening of our own national security. That I'd like to hear an answer to.
And do you know how this money would actually be used by the Ukrainians, their ground forces? Are they in a position to put it to good use?
Look, the disparity between the Russian and Ukraine armed forces is so great that's why I said at the outset here, even $60 billion is going to be a drop in the bucket. And you can see that in the first 18 months of the war, we gave them a total of, including the European Union, $200 billion and thousands of armored vehicles and military vehicles of various sorts, and it did absolutely nothing to push Russia out. Now Russia's pushed in Ukraine to the west. Every day they have more and more territory that they're conquering. And the disparity is like 10 to 1, or 10,000 to 2,000 artillery shells per day. The Russians are having a huge advantage in drone warfare now because of electronic warfare. We're up to 80% of the Ukrainian drones are getting knocked out of the sky electronically. So everywhere you look, they're getting pushed back. So a handful of artillery shells or rockets or anything else is not going to have any effect, even tactically.
Does this have anything to do with this debate that's been circulating around the Taurus missile? I read that France and Germany there's some internal debate as to whether or not they should send this particular kind of weapon to Ukraine. Apparently, public opinion in Germany shows that most people oppose sending this Taurus missile to Ukraine. Is this part of the asymmetry that you're describing with the drones that they currently have in use?
Well, it's a recognition, in my view, by the Chancellor Scholz that it's not going to make any difference. A handful of long-range missiles is not going to make any difference. It would require German troops to be on the ground to help them operate because it's a very complex cruise missile system. It's not something you just fire and forget sort of thing. And he's not willing to put German troops at risk, especially given recent comments by Putin. But yeah, I think he's recognizing that this is not going to change anything. So why get rid of the few Taurus missiles they have? Because these things take a long time and are very expensive to produce. And, there is a big issue between France and Germany and others. I think that today Macron is going to address his nation, and he's going to say, hey, we need to not be cowards, and we need to be thinking about doing more for Ukraine, maybe even on the ground, and not take that off the table, which is crazy. That's nonsensical talk. That could escalate of war, and it's not going to make any difference even if he did it. Even if Putin was bluffing about nuclear war, then why would we ever want to find out? But that just shows some of the dispute and disparity between some of the NATO members themselves.
On the Russian front, Putin is up for re-election beginning tomorrow, I believe. At the start of the war, we heard, this was kind of a narrative that was popular in the media. I don't know how true exactly it was, that there was a lot of dissatisfaction in Russia over the war. Some early economic consequences that were being felt as a result of that. There was speculation about what this would mean for Putin. Of course, it didn't end up meaning any sort of collapse of his government. We saw what happened to Prigozhin, et cetera. But, what do you think is likely to be the outcome of that? And do we have any knowledge about, where the people of Russia are in terms of their thinking about this war?
Yeah, we do, and it was always puzzling to me, and just really a self-disinformation campaign on our part against us to ever try to say that the people of Russia were going to turn against Putin because of this war here. Because you have to have not been paying any attention to Russian history or recent Russian cultural issues to think that suddenly that they're going to turn against Putin after decades of being with him, especially on something where he could painted a picture and a plausible one from his people that this was the West against Russia, that they were trying to bring military weapons right up to their border, which was an existential threat to Russia. So there have been obviously a handful of people that turn against or protest against the war from time to time, but there is overwhelming support for Putin within Russia. And especially now when it's self-evident that on the battlefield, things are in Russia's favor and they're going to be decisively in that direction. So his support is as high as it's ever been. And I think that the bigger threat for the West right now is that everything that we have done is going to leave Putin in a stronger position, both in his country and in the region at the end of this, instead of weakening him as we had hoped.
Well, you just referenced the end of this. We've talked a lot about what seems not to be working. What, in your view, would bring this crisis to a conclusion?
A recognition by the West, and especially the United States, of the ground truth reality, however unpleasant it is, that Ukraine will never militarily win this war. Period. No matter how much money we give them, how many tanks or anything else, the balance of power, the things that go into building national combat power are decisively and irrevocably on Russia's side. And as long as we ignore that, we're going to increase our harm. If we recognize just the truth of it, then we need to say, all right, let's just cut our losses here and let's minimize the damage by getting a negotiated settlement and coming together to get the best deal we can get for Ukraine so that they stay a free country with with whatever we can get out of it. Now, that sounds bad, and a lot of people reject that. But here's the hard truth. If you don't go down that path, the likelihood is the longer this goes, the worse deal Ukraine gets and the less territory they end up with. It can get worse.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always my pleasure. Thanks, Robbie.